Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the APUS History World. That's my classroom behind me. This is a little side room here where I'm sitting grading some DBQs, and I thought I'd take this opportunity to sit and talk about the second installment of our In Case You Missed It. In case you missed some part of the study guide or some part of what was going on in class, maybe you're absent that day, maybe you were sitting in class staring at me wondering about the meaning of life. Who knows? But in case you missed it, we're going to pick up on the second page here of the study guide, ladies and gentlemen, right where it says the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre, right there. It's 1770. If you're looking for prior information on the study guide, check out Unit 1, the 1760s. This one's going to be Unit 2, the 1770s, and then predictably, Unit 2, 1780s and 90s will follow this one. But let's get down to it, the Boston Massacre. In 1775, Americans were shot by British redcoats in Boston. Now, you have to understand that Boston by 1770 was a really charged city. There were 4 Americans for every redcoat. The British had packed so many redcoats into Boston because they realized that it was really the center of the rebellion. And as the center of the rebellion, they wanted to make sure to have a lot of redcoats on hand in case something happened. And even a childish prank, which really what the snowball fight that turned into the Boston Massacre was, even a childish prank like this can lead to serious consequences. The 5 Americans who are killed leave behind this idea that Americans are no longer going to be able to get along with the British in any way. And as the story of the massacre goes rippling through the colonies, it becomes more and more apparent that a lot of Americans are ready for a change in the definition of the relationship between ourselves and Britain. A few years later, in 1773, following my way down the study guide here, the Tea Act was passed. Now, the Tea Act, in essence, wasn't an increase in tea taxes, it was a decrease. In 1773, the British Parliament, looking to aid one of Britain's biggest companies, the British East India Company, the BEICO, or BICO, passed a law allowing BICO tea to get into the colonies without any sort of tax or tariff. Effectively, what that was supposed to do was boost sales of BICO tea and guarantee that Americans would buy BICO tea and put them back into a financially positive position. Now, as an American, you generally didn't drink the British tea, partially because you preferred the flavor of the Dutch tea, and also because you kind of wanted to stick it to the man. And by drinking the Dutch tea, you weren't drinking the British tea, and that made you feel very good about yourself, if you're a patriot at this point. When the first shipment of tea arrived in Boston Harbor in 1773, Americans were there to greet it. Dressed up as Native Americans, the Sons of Liberty stormed the ships and threw the tea into the harbor. And no, it did not create some enormous pool of Lipton iced tea that people sat around drinking with like sprigs of mint and chunks of lemon. It was not like that. It was a horrible mess, but it was not like that. The British were upset about this, understandably, and that leads to the next thing on our study guide, what we're going to call the Coercive or Intolerable Acts of 1774. The British called them the Coercive Acts. We, as Americans, called them the Intolerable Acts. The acts specifically targeted Massachusetts for the problems of the Boston Tea Party. 4 parts of the Coercive Acts. Number 1, Boston Harbor was closed. That would have meant death to anyone who made good money off of the Boston Harbor, which was a lot of that colony. Number 2, New England town hall meetings were banned, which means that our attempts at self-government are being limited. Number 3, you cannot conduct trials of justice against any British soldiers because they were worried that if a British soldier were arrested and tried, they would face a clearly biased jury there in Massachusetts. Number 4, and last, more redcoats were going to be stationed in Boston. So Boston's becoming more and more the hub of things going on. If you're an American by now, 1774, it's clear that we need to talk. And in the fall of 1774, delegates from the states sat down at what we call the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress was an attempt to discuss common issues that they had with King George III. Prime on the list of things to do, number 1, to try and figure out what to do about the lingering issue here. The Americans put forward a threat to the British, and the threat is this. As with any other time, we're going to boycott your goods. We've done that before. But if you don't repeal the Coercive or Intolerable Acts within 1 year, that is to say by the fall of 1775, we are no longer going to ship you any of the raw materials that you so desperately need for your empire. So we are trying to economically really put the English into a poor position here. That's the way you should treat them, right? We found out that every time you boycott the English, it works well. Now we're threatening a flat-out embargo. We're not going to send them any goods at all. In the same breath, the British, or the Americans, I beg your pardon, make it clear that they're loyal to King George and that they're willing to stick around if King George will redefine the relationship that we have with them, to allow us the right perhaps to elect our own representatives and to tax ourselves. Off goes that information to England, and in the time that Parliament is considering the matter, and frankly George is getting ready for a war that he knows is going to happen, trouble breaks out anyway. Going down my study guide here, I find, in fact, hold on, before that, likely to support the Patriots. Your Patriots are going to be people like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, Boston individuals, merchants, anyone in the Americas who had any kind of money, except for the uber wealthy, who would probably be more on the loyalist side of this column. They're probably going to be your patriots. Now, it's fair to say that the vast majority of Americans were patriots. Of the 2.5 million people living in the Americas at the time, roughly 100,000 or so were loyalists. The rest of them were at least midway towards being silent or patriot, and so we're going to put them on that patriot side eventually. As I said, violence is going to break out later on here in Lexington and Concord, and that's where we bring in our Minutemen. Minutemen are soldiers who are ready to go at a moment's notice, and once we shoot at each other at Lexington and Concord, it's clear that we need something more permanent than the First Continental Congress. What do we need? We need the Second Continental Congress. Ta-da! Great name. Okay, the Second Continental Congress really becomes the functioning government of the colonies, now states, as we move towards independence over the next several months. It met in Philadelphia, and it cut off trade completely with Britain, as it had promised to do, and at the same time it also established a Continental Army under the control of General Washington. It set up a government, what we're going to call the Articles of Confederation. That's a very weak form of government. That's what a lot of these states wanted, was a weak bond to each other. But it also allowed that government to make war and make peace and make treaties and to run the war as best as possible. The two key events of 1776 are the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is really a document drafted to the common man, and Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Following down the study guide here, I'm asked to talk about the intended audience of Common Sense, the common guy. People who would have known ideas like, when a man reaches the age of adulthood, he should leave his parents' house. And you'd go, yeah, he should. And that makes sense in that way. So the arguments that Paine puts forward are very common. They would have been references that the average person understood. Jefferson, on the other hand, is looking for something much different. Jefferson is talking here about an audience that is elite and educated and enlightened. We're going to use John Locke and Montesquieu and all of the big Enlightenment bigwigs in our theories, but really heavily on Locke here. As we talk about logical arguments for independence, here's what we believe as enlightened individuals. Here's what George III has done. What else would you have us do? Jefferson is very much presenting a law case. Here's what we have to abide by. Here's how we've been treated. There's nothing else we can do. He's speaking to people on both sides of the Atlantic, trying to convince them that this is the next logical step for them. This next section of the study guide asks us to talk about why we won the Revolutionary War, and that's going to range into the 1780s as well. But let me say this for the 1770s. Early on in the war, we are spared defeat by a couple of things. Number one, British generals who don't want to press us too hard because they're afraid of losing, and also because they think if they show us that we can't win, that we'll give up fighting. We're also saved by the savvy technique of George Washington, who manages to lose, but not lose big in a lot of the early battles. And the thing that really comes in handy is the 1778 victory at Saratoga. When we win at Saratoga, we're able to convince the French that they should help us in the war. French assistance in a military and financial way is going to be monumentally important to us in winning the war. We're also going to be very thankful, as I look at the rest of my study guide here, in the diplomatic reasons. We're going to be thankful for loans from the Dutch, from the French, and also from some English individuals who'd love to see this war end. And we're going to be thankful that we have a solid cadre of founding brothers. The Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Monroe, Washington generation. Washington's a tad older, but that whole generation that is helping us to win this war. I'm going to sign off here for the 1770s. The war's not quite over. It ranges into the 1780s, but we're coming up on the 10-minute mark, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it's helpful. Hope you log on and look at the Unit 2, Part 3, the 1780s in a minute. Take care.